Hey guys, for my final project, I decided to take a look at Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper. I'm sure many of you have seen this painting. It is one of the most recognized and most well-known paintings of the Western world, and it has become something that has been super important for art history, and it is truly priceless and has changed art for the better. This painting is 15 feet and 1 inch by 29 feet. It is a wall mural made of tempera, mastic, gesso, oil, and pitch paint. It is housed in the refectory of the convent of Santa Maria dei Grazie in Milan, Italy. It was commissioned by the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, and it was completed between 1495 and 1498. Something that is super important that we have to talk about this painting is that it was painted during the High Renaissance, and the High Renaissance is one of the most important time periods for art. But something that is super interesting about this time period is that there is not a date or a year that signifies the beginning of this period. The beginning of the High Renaissance is actually the completion of the Last Supper painting. This was a time, or the High Renaissance is a time when history, philosophy, the arts, and the sciences were widely celebrated. New techniques were being developed all the time. Artists were trying to find a way to create a more beautiful, harmonious whole while drawing together different components of a piece. These new techniques, while they were new, they were being utilized in ways to incorporate classical art references into what was the modern day creativity. So when we think of the High Renaissance, we think of Leonardo da Vinci, who is called the ultimate Renaissance man, who we think was doing all of these things spectacularly. And the end of the High Renaissance was in 1527 when Rome fell to the imperial troops of Charles V of England. Again, here is the painting. And a little bit about the history. In 1652, the residents of the monastery cut a new doorway in the wall and removed Jesus' feet, so we are missing a part of the original painting. Then in the 18th century, Napoleon Bonaparte's troops used the refectory as stables, and this continued to decompose and degrade the rest of the painting. During World War II, the Nazis bombed the monastery and reduced the surrounding walls to rubble, and the only one that was left standing was the wall with the Last Supper painted on it. And throughout history, there have been many attempts to restore and protect the original work, and the largest of these efforts was completed in the 1990s. So the Last Supper is a very simple piece. It shows Jesus and his 12 disciples at a table covered in cloth and food, in a single room with windows only in the background. The only colors and textures come from the clothing of the disciples, which draws your eyes to them. And this is how you notice their faces of astonishment, anger, terror, and despair. But you also notice the great balance and the symmetry and the abundance of straight lines within the piece, which I think is super interesting. It seems so simple and so straightforward, but it tells such a compelling message. Another important thing to note is that Leonardo da Vinci used the vanishing point technique in order to create the correct proportions and to create depth within this piece. It almost feels as though we could step right into the painting with the disciples, and I think that was something that Leonardo da Vinci did on purpose. He wanted us to feel a part of the story that he was telling us, and I think that is super cool. So within making this painting, Da Vinci decided to forego all of the details and perfected techniques that people had considered a part of what makes art good and special up until this time. He really focused on making his art, making the Last Supper simple so that he could communicate this compelling story that the majority of the world knows, and that is that Jesus told his disciples at the Last Supper that one of them would betray him before the night is over. And I really think that Da Vinci was incredibly successful in communicating the story to us. The simplicity of the room and the vibrancy of the disciples' faces and their clothing just really draws us in and makes us realize that this was probably a crazy night for them. And Da Vinci really did his best to draw us in and make us feel like we were actually there with the disciples, which is why I think that this piece is super successful.